So Leslie, take us to the Inner Harbor.
So before I begin, I just wanted to give a quick thank you to Professor Carr Dupuy and James Tillman and Professor Kaliji for helping me through this process and guiding me through it. And before I begin, just to give you a brief summary of what I'll be talking about today. I'll start off with existing site conditions, going into some of the metrics of the site, moving into precedent studies, diagrams, initial schemes, and then the more final proposed scheme for this site. So with that, I'll begin. So this is from Hill to Harbor. This thesis focuses on bringing an art hub onto Baltimore Civic waterfront of the Inner Harbor, specifically on Rash Field. Rash Field is considered to be the last essential remaining vacant space within the Inner Harbor Promenade. It's located on the South Shore end, making it the least pedestrian traveled section of the entire Inner Harbor Promenade. The goals and focus of this thesis is to promote a better exchange and communication between the tourists, the local members of the community, and really anyone that comes to the Inner Harbor, using art as that major generator and focus, in hopes that it will also revitalize and reuse the South Shore end of the Inner Harbor Promenade. And with that, going into the existing site conditions, I began by trying to understand the different buildings and building use that are currently within the Inner Harbor and around it. So looking at the office spaces, moving into commercial. So because the Inner Harbor is currently a major tourist attraction to Baltimore City, essentially around the promenade you'll see numerous amounts of retail shops and commercial spaces. Then looking at also restaurants. So the major restaurant that I looked at is the Rusty Scupper, in the sense that looking at that relationship with Rash Field and the close proximity to it. And then looking at some of the hotels. And then as far as education, most of the education that will be within the area is all in the Federal Hill community, so along this, and it's mainly secondary education. Then looking at residential, so because Baltimore is such a historic place, in the Federal Hill area you'll see a lot of historic row homes and modernized row homes, along with mixed use and high-rise apartments. The major one being the Harbor View apartments and condos that share a pedestrian promenade into pedestrian path into the Inner Harbor Promenade. And then looking at museums, so when looking at the different museums and landmarks, that was something that was very intriguing when doing research on this site, because I was very curious in learning about the current public facilities that are being offered at the Inner Harbor. So going across the street from my site, looking at the American Visionary Museum, it's essentially a museum that houses 40 permanent exhibitions and really focus on bringing in artwork from local members of the community who've never had any form of training in art. And then going across from my site, looking at the Maryland Science Center, it's essentially an interactive science facility, making it really great for younger students and families to come in and do interactive science. Then going into the Baltimore Visitor Center, which is kind of in the center of the promenade, it's essentially a great place for a great starting point where you can begin to ask questions of what kind of events are happening within the Inner Harbor, what can I do, and essentially buy tickets for certain museums and attractions within the Inner Harbor. And then going across the Patapsco River, looking at the aquarium, it's two main buildings, one that houses all the mammal, and then the other the bird sanctuary and fish, with a really nice pedestrian bridge that connects the two together. And then also for those of you who are interested in history, there's currently 3 ships that are docked at the Inner Harbor, making it a really great place for you to learn how these ships impacted the Inner Harbor, what they did during the war, and it's just a really great experience. Then looking at vehicular circulation and pedestrian circulation, I began by looking at the major roadways around the Inner Harbor. So starting at the top, that's East Pratt Street, which turns into Light Street, that brings you into the Federal Hill community. And then the major road of Key Highway, which passes through my site. It's a 4-lane major roadway, 2-way traffic, making it very not pedestrian friendly. And also another great resource is the water taxi. I believe there's about 18 stops, and most of them happen within the harbor, but it's also a really great resource for the community members if they need to go into the Harbor East Fells Point area or down to where Locust Point, Fort McHenry is. Then going into the green spaces and parking, initially my site is here in the middle, and around that you have 2 major parking spots. One that focuses on parking for the Maryland Science Center, while the other is mainly for the Rusty Scupper. And then also a major green space that I wanted to focus on a relationship between Rashfield and Federal Hill Park was something that I looked at throughout this thesis. So going into some of the images of that, so looking at that image, it's pretty much the main view that you'll get of Rashfield, and then you have this really big landmark to Baltimore, Federal Hill Park, where you'll get really amazing views into the city. And then also looking at the water's edge and promenade, essentially because I will be redefining the water's edge and promenade to the Inner Harbor. So going into more of the history of Rashfield, so Rashfield was first designed in 1976, initially as a football stadium for Southern High School. It was a football stadium for several years, but then around the late 1980s and 1990s, it pretty much became an essential vacant space to the Inner Harbor. Then in 1999, the Baltimore Beach establishment came about, and they were really interested in creating more events for the community and really anyone who came to the area. So they made 7 different volleyball fields that would have public and private volleyball games. And then the image at the bottom showcases the stadium seating that is around Rashfield. Going into more of the metrics, I began by doing a series of site sections just to understand the main portion of Rashfield and Federal Hill Park. So looking at that relationship, so this is Key Highway. You can see that it's not very, it's only 35 feet wide with one pedestrian sidewalk. That is a little intimidating trying to cross that street. And then looking at that relationship that it has to the Inner Harbor and the Maryland Science Center. Going into Precedent Studies, I really focused on looking at Precedent Studies that dealt with the water's edge, that really were all about the community, allowing the community to revisit the waterfront and engage the waterfront, and then looking at some architectural precedents that dealt with being a civic center, a cultural center, that also wanted the community to revisit the water. So going into some of the diagrams, I began by looking at the existing geometry and how that relationship tied into Rashfield and Federal Hill Park, and also the geometry within the Baltimore Inner Harbor. Then looking at where those areas began to intersect and connect with one another, along with focusing on this area as a major zone. Then also looking at the green spaces and then beginning to question why can't Federal Hill Park continue that experience from hill to harbor. Then looking at the different negative spaces and the spaces that aren't really occupied within the site. And then also looking at the major zones, so looking at how the Maryland Science Center and the Harbor View Apartments are a major zone, and that zone of Federal Hill Park, and then also looking at the promenade and what kind of zone that was creating. And then pretty much when looking at all of them combined, I began to understand the geometry and really what the Inner Harbor was doing. And then began to ask myself questions as, what am I trying to propose? What kind of experience do I want these people to have? And really throughout this entire process, I really questioned the idea of why can't Federal Hill Park continue from where it is? Why does it have to be where it is? And this idea of potentially adding a new gateway, a new destination point to the people who come to this area. So going into the initial schemes, it was really about reactivating the site and playing around with the existing conditions, following some of the regulating lines that I did earlier in that geometry that's currently in the Inner Harbor. And as far as the program, it was about introducing a gallery exhibition space, an auditorium, and a food market that could be enjoyed by the public. And then later on, working on this idea of creating a bar scheme where essentially a portion of that bar would be inserted into Federal Hill Park. So the idea was that when you were on top of the park, you had that experience of continuing your current situation, so going from Federal Hill Park over the Inner Harbor and then onto, or experiencing the water. So these were some initial schemes, and then also the master planning that would happen where Rashfield is currently. So going into the more finalized approach, so I essentially designed it based on 2 zones. So looking at the zone from the Maryland Science Center and where Federal Hill Park begins, that became more of a area that the public could utilize. So introducing a food market that maybe there's local chefs that interchange. So it kind of becomes like a union market type setting where there's different types of food and different things going on, and then having an outdoor event space that could then spill out. You could have flea markets on the weekends, and really just keeping that experience going. And then adding an auditorium that could be utilized by the other buildings within the Inner Harbor, and really maybe if there's a local artist who's interested in giving a lecture about painting, they could also potentially do that there. And then the second zone, the major zone, looking at that area of Federal Hill Park and how that communicates to Rushfield and the Inner Harbor, it was really about keeping that green space very pure and clean. So introducing a sculpture garden that could be a temporary sculpture garden, where local artists and really anyone that was interested in showcasing their creativity could have that opportunity. And then introducing an area where you can grow food and plants that could then relate back to the food market. So if you were a local cook in the area, you could have the opportunity of getting some tomatoes or something and bring that into the food market and continue making your dish. And then having the main entry to the bar, and then also introducing program that would happen underneath the staircase, the main staircase on this pier. So moving up into the floor plan, a portion of the program is inserted into Federal Hill Park, and this became an intermediate workshop creating space. And then once you emerge from the park, it becomes more open with a series of gift shops and bookstores, and then ending at a coffee shop that then allows you to step down and cascade down into the harbor. And then going to the floor above that, the major space, this is all gallery space. So the idea is that you would enter from Federal Hill Park, which you can see in that image. And then once you emerge from that park, you're surrounded by different types of art, 2D and 3D, that anyone is interested in showcasing, and then ending with really great views to the harbor. And then when looking at the roof plan, the really big inspiration as to where I placed the building was really about looking at the aquarium and that relationship, and again, looking at the existing site conditions. So the idea is that once you're at the top of Federal Hill Park, you have that opportunity of continuing your experience. So the roof became a series of gardens, and this idea of continuing that experience with art by having temporary sculptures along with gardens and planting beds. So when looking at it in elevation and section, as far as the material goes, I really wanted the elevation to be very clean and crisp and really showcase the gallery space of the project. And then in section, you can see how you enter the gallery space, you have the intermediate level, and then how that begins to step down into this pier, so you have more experience with the water. And then this is an image showing the new gateway condition, where you can see how you kind of go up from Federal Hill Park and continue that experience, and then looking at the different greeneries that happen within the area, or within that site. And with that, I would like to end. So if you have any questions or comments, I'd be happy to. Sure.
It's a neat idea, the idea of getting from Federal Hill down to the water. One of your early sketches showed it going out a lot further into the water. How did you, one of those little concept sketches?
Yeah. So
how did you?
Some of them are here.
Yes.
These.
How did you end up determining the length of this?
So it was based on the structure component of the building. So initially, this was 1,000 feet, which when I was talking about it with the chair and the committee, it didn't really make sense. So then I ended up pushing it back maybe like 3 or 4 times. And then initially when I came up with the structural system for the building, I wanted all of that to make sense, so I cut it back shorter.
So it's not really about the site itself, it's about how the building's made, the length of it.
Yes.
Because what happens is that you get out to the end of this thing and you're waiting for that, grand finale, and you can't look back down to the right. The rusty scupper is in the way. I would like this project a lot better if you also called the rusty scupper and tore it down. I mean, it's a pretty ambitious project. I think to throw that in is probably a worthwhile investment to make.
I think my comments are at least an extension of that conversation. The length of it and just like how it terminates. I really kind of want it to bend. You know, it's interesting because a lot of the previous projects we've been talking about the urban characteristics and its relationship, and I really want to talk about architecture on this one. And I feel like you became kind of a slave to the diagram you did with these zones, and it just like lives in this one edge of the zone, and I want it to like bend and like extend and look back like into the main part of the harbor somehow. And I also want the sides of it, the surfaces of it to be, one, it's really difficult to have that much gallery space with all that glass. And the other thing that happens is because it's all glass, again, like you're not focusing the view in a way. So I really want it to like be more solid along the edges and then become much more porous at the end. Not that it just has to be a one window on the end, but could the end of it like break away from the solid? And then the last part of it is just, you have so much ground plane. Do you really need all of this ground plane here? Because if that wasn't there, or if this thing bent, then it would come out over the water, and it would become, you're occupying the water instead of, again, on this kind of built-up landscape. And there's all this on the landscape, and there's the roof terrace, and there's the Federal Hill relationship. So I just feel like there's a lot of things that compete with each other, and I think you could clarify it a little bit to make the big move stronger.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think
That's okay. I'll say something after.
I think that's right, and which is, again, my comment about maybe it goes that further. There's a major leap of faith in this project. And I think to pull it back by 20 feet based on construction conditions that probably can solve this. It's not the right thing to do. Also, going back to the comment about blocking certain views and opening certain views, I also wonder about the way this plan itself relates to the landscape. In other words, you have this garden coming through here, and then suddenly that's where the core is, where I would expect to find a really great gallery right there that looks back across that space. I also would not put a stair there. I'd find a really great gallery there on the end and pull the stair back. So if each one of these things responded to the landscape next to it, I think it would be a stronger scheme.
Well, I guess my first question is, did you ask Brian what happens when this floods?
That would have been a good question.
But, so, first thing I just want to point out 2 projects in Lisboa, Portugal, that you ought to take a look at if you haven't. One is called the MOT, which I believe stands for Museum of Architectural Art and Technology or something, but it's right on the water, and it's really interesting how you go from the river walk and can actually get up to the roof of the building and overlook everything. And the other is right near there, and it's a cultural center that's maybe 15, 20 years old. But again, you're taking people off of the street level and up to different levels to overlook the water, and you might find it interesting. This is a pretty simple solution when you get right down to it, and you're building while aggressive is relatively simple. And this is an architecture school, and what I would like to see is for you to take one piece of this and do a drawing this big and really say, how are you putting the architectural pieces together? And do you really believe this? I mean, when I look at this, it looks like these are all tube sections that were invisibly welded together. And is that really what you mean? Or are you going to express the connections and the layering of the different parts? They're not all the same size, but you kind of look at this and you look at this condition, and is this a steel beam? How does the exterior plaster on the south end meet it? You've got such a repetitive system. I wish you would have really asked the architectural questions of how the pieces go together, because in the end, that's what separates mediocre modern architecture, pedestrian stuff, from really great, beautiful buildings. You look at Renzo Piano's museums, and just how the pieces go together are spectacular. You look at the same buildings done for $200 a square foot rather than $2,000 a square foot, and they're nowhere near as successful. But that's what I would have liked to see.
Yeah, I did, thank you.
Leslie, I'm wondering if you looked at two buildings. One that you probably remember from your first year, Lina Bobardi's Maspe Museum.
Yeah.
And then the second is Kevin Roche and Dinkalu's entrance to the UMass Amherst campus. Did you take a look at
No.
that? Okay. So it might be interesting for you at this point to revisit Maspe. Maspe is in Sao Paulo, and it was in the exhibit on Lina Bobardi. And it's a very big, long building, but then underneath, with the single, no columns inside, right, hovering above the ground. And the space underneath that is used by the community in so many different ways, right? For yoga, for films, for political demonstrations, plus it's on a hill that has a view. So that's one of the things I would think about. There's also a whole section of it, if you remember, underground because of the hill. So when I'm looking at this, and then let me say something, the Roche Dinkalu project is the entrance to UMass. It's a concrete, beautiful, brutalist project. It's endless. I don't know if it's a half a mile long or whatever. But it creates a barrier between the automobile part, the vehicular part of the campus, and the pedestrian part. So there's a sense when you go under it, when there's two different scales, that there's a difference in the two, and also, you know, how they're treating the ends. And so what I'm thinking about both of those relative to your project is one, when we see here, there's another view kind of this way. And it feels like all this area is really given to driving. And I wonder if there might be a way to rethink this, and also to think about your major move is going from here to here, but there's also a potential for a gate here. And then the second thing is, I really, like, you can get from here to the top, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you have to go inside to go out, right? You
Yeah,
have to,
the major the staircase.
I really wish you had packed something up that could also potentially be a vertical in contrast, and it could be a tower perhaps, but that allows one to kind of keep on the outside and go out here. And acknowledging kind of you have an incredible opportunity because of the grade change, and connect these folks here in this community to the water's edge, not just view.
Very, very good point. I think, like your classmates earlier, the fact that they're looking at these global issues, and your project decidedly is different. It's very singular. However, because this is the University of Architecture, where we look at architecture, urban design, everything inclusive, I'm not going to let you get away with that, because I'm a product of here as well. You mentioned Rashfield, and you went through this explanation diagrammatically of what it was, what it could be, but then I sort of look at your solution to it, and I'm wondering if there's something missing. And when I say that, I look at the general context of the harbor. You brilliantly sort of was going around the harbor, sort of explaining museums and these sort of art components and civic components and whatnot, and you march your way around. But when I get to your immediate site, I just see plaques. And you mentioned they could be urban farming and whatnot, but I'm like, yeah, urban farming 3 months a year. This is Baltimore. You can grow stuff in the summer, but in the winter, what happens there? That's a big expanse of spaces that is not, and you might have a few sculptures here and there, but could it be much more robust in terms of how you program those spaces and connect it to the harbor? Because what I love about the diagram that you were mentioning earlier is, you mentioned the water taxi and like all this stuff that sort of bounced back and forth across the Patapsco. Are there ways of knitting this sort of terra firma, this sort of flat land that you've gotten rid of the sports components, but what are you putting back in place? You know, and I was going to mention the fact that I'm, thinking of a study abroad that I took while I was here to Paris, but we went to London. I'm sorry, Parc des Citoyens, where they sort of have this sort of division of, even though that's an urban sort of part, but the way they sort of partition the land and make these joyful moments as you go from space to space, and things go up and down. You might get a pavilion or a folly here and there. And I wonder if you had sort of incorporated that into the terra firma. I think it would have been a much more joyous space to be in, especially during the fall and winter months that you can't grow stuff there. The second part has to do with the architecture itself. I think it's a bold statement. But you keep mentioning gateway, and I'm like, gateway to where? Am I gateway towards, Locust Point? Or is it gateway towards the city? What gateway?
So the gateway I was talking about,
Because when I hear gateway, I'm thinking threshold, right? Like a portal that I'm going.
so it's essentially, this is the new gateway that I'm creating.
Across the bay.
What's framing it on the other side? That's bookending.
I was looking at the aquarium and where that stops, and that determined the area that I put that.
Okay. Thanks for explaining that. Then my follow-up question would be, what is the gateway that you're creating? What am I going to as I pass through this gateway? Am I going to the Civic or Artistic Hub up there in the harbor?
Yeah, you're going to the art hub.
So I would expect to see a diagram that goes to my very first question that ties this to everything that you've created within that gateway, right? Like, if you're saying this is a threshold and this is what I'm coming to, I want to see a diagram that links them all, that doesn't make it like an isolated piece, that's just there. You've created architecture that says gateway, but none of these are speaking to what's there, urbanistically. So with your architecture, I actually love this lyrical way that, I've been on this hill many times, sitting there sketching, whatever. This lyrical way of almost sort of introducing this highline-esque sort of component to it. There's this linear garden that you come down. But I would expect, in the same way as Ronit was mentioning, looking at a section of this as this sort of terraced component, as you sort of come down, as the street winds up to Federal Hill, I would expect people to be able to traverse almost in a stepped way as they go to the waterfront, as opposed to, oh, I'm going in, then I have to go all the way to the end and then find a ladder that gets me down to the waterfront. I wonder if there's a way, exterior-wise, that you can sort of do that cascading along the side of it to sort of help tie back to the landscape that you're referencing.
Yeah.
But I also was going to ask you, are you looking at the structure of the convention center where you were looking at this? Is that where you were drawing from, the convention center?
Yeah, like I was looking at that and then looking at the other buildings around the area that I guess express the structure.
So it goes to what the gentleman was saying. If you're going to do that, like a blow-up section that shows all those details and celebrate them as sort of like, it's a singular, almost repetitive system, but here's why I'm celebrating it, because it's indigenous to the harbor, it's indigenous to the convention center. This is an architect that's being used repeatedly. Here's the new way that I'm reinventing it, by showing a blow-up diagram.
I agree with that sentiment as well, and I think there's a lot of strong kind of diagrammatic moves in the facade, but I think the rendering itself is maybe leaving a little too much to the imagination. I think there's a lot of good thoughts there, and they might not be coming through. I'm really fascinated by this edge of the waterfront that you're talking about, and you showed a really nice diagram about how you're connecting that sort of pedestrian walkway, and this is different than what was there before. I could imagine a really nice series of kind of sections about how that ground plane is relating to the water and what that means in terms of how people are using it. So I'm starting to see hints at, you've got a darker gray thing going on over here, and then it comes to beige. I'm not sure what the difference of those two is. It looks like you've got some living shoreline, something green happening, then there's a raised edge, and then it looks like you're stepping into the water a little bit. I'd love to hear more about how you kind of designed what went where, what you expect, how you think that interaction changes as you move along that walkway.
So the stepping down part of this new pier that I was adding was based on this relationship. And then as far as the change in material, the idea is that this would feel more like a pier, so maybe that material is wood, And then this would follow the existing material that's currently at the Inner Harbor. And then as far as the green, patches of green on the water, I wanted to introduce floating wetlands to make it a little more greener. And then also introducing areas where you could potentially kayak around that and have more engagement with the harbor.
I can imagine a really nice spacey ice cream where you're talking about
Yeah,
that
so-
lunch meeting. I can imagine kids loving dipping their toes in the water along the.
So this becomes a cafe or coffee shop. So the idea is that when you get whatever your food, you can come out, experience this, and potentially, like as you were saying, go into the water or dip your feet in.
Leslie, I like your project a lot. I think it's got a lot of nice moves and the, kind of the basic impulse of how you get people from the upper park across the major roadway and then down to the waterfront. I like it. There's a lot of compelling images in the project. One question I have about the architecture and its relationship to the structure is in the big perspective at the top and then the elevations and sections, there's kind of there's the truss level, right? But then there's kind of an undercroft. And there's a kind of a question about why isn't the truss either a lot higher or all that undercroft stuff program, that space stuck into the depth of the truss. You know, at one point you're expressing this span, and then at the next level down, it's not really being expressed. So there's a question about that. And the other thing is, just with the truss, there's kind of the endpoints, how it's held up. So how it meets the park, how do you decide to, engage it into the park or lift it up and have it sit on the park? And then at the other end, what's holding it up? What's its other abutment, right? So you've got the spanning elements,
Yeah.
but I'm wondering about the abutments as well.
So as far as the truss or the structure of the building, when I was doing the research, I initially made it into a box truss system and then having two-way beam systems that would go inside. And then initially, so this portion became the core of the building. So throughout the building, there's this core that goes all the way to the main gallery space. And then as far as like the change in material, I really just wanted to emphasize the gallery space and keep everything underneath that very clean and simple. But I mean, that is something I probably could have looked at, is potentially having that same portion for the intermediate level, but I guess that would be the next step.
I sort of feel like the structural janitor here, but I'm going to do it anyway. First of all, I think Steve's suggestion of extending it longer, Rusty Scupper does not deserve to be the Colossus of Rhodes. The structure is significant in its simplicity and its termination of the space at the Inner Harbor. I think it's great, but it's got to sit on something. I don't see it being supported anywhere. And the secondary structure that spans across your gallery is, what, 50, 60 feet?
You mean?
The transverse span has got to have some depth as well. And Peter's suggestion of the incorporation of the other stuff is a reasonable suggestion, except the simplicity of this is really quite good. It's just that it has to sit on something. I thought it was a cantilever at the beginning.
It does cantilever.
About how much?
It's
136
cantilevering all the
feet.
way across. You can do anything digitally,
You realize
but
how-
physically, it's another question.
You realize how massive that land structure is?
Yeah.
It's gonna go over to China. It's gonna pay a little bit of that. But I do agree that there are opportunities of handling to shorten the cantilever as opposed to destroying historic Federal Hill by putting this massive thing that's gonna hold it up on. There are episodic moments that you could introduce that could help limit the cantilever. I was looking at a section here, I was like, oh, this would be ideal, but then I realized that that's why you have your grants there, which there might be a way of introducing structure. So visually, it looks like it's that long, but your physical structural cantilever is limited because there are implications of such moves.
I think that one image right there really drove a lot of the scheme. And I think we've all seen that building before. And I think that image is what really, sort of captivated the end of this thing. I would have liked this better if the floor below the upper floor was taken away.
Yeah, that's what
I think that, I mean, it was simply that one floor, very likely crossing the road and making it out to the water. You know, you just call it from hill to harbor. And if from that, maybe you collect all that program and put it out on the end. It's something where you end up with something where you can then work your way down inside this building and get down to the harbor itself. So I just think it was driven a little bit too much by that image of this thing sticking out.
So I'll respectfully disagree with Mr. Muse in terms of the understructure, that under level. I think it could have worked out really nicely, but it goes back to your lack of exploration into how the parts work. And, you know, what I'm basically seeing is a 2-story glass structure supported inside your trusses and hanging from the top board. And if you had developed what are these light gray or white columns, and then you're dividing that space into 4 with mullions or whatever, if you had really developed that into some sort of, you know, cable or otherwise hanging structure and played it up and made it something, but you just haven't provided us with enough detail to know whether it's successful. Going to a 360-degree turn in subject, why a museum? This could have been any program you wanted to connect Federal Hill and make a gateway, and Baltimore already has 2 wonderful art museums. The BMA, under a new director, is going overboard trying to make everything about inclusionism and assorted related stuff, and you're taking what is potentially an elitist institution and using it as your bridge when you could have chosen any other building type, because there was no program for this, right?
So to answer that question, I think art allows you to not only express yourself creatively, but it gives you a voice when you may not think you have one. And the Inner Harbor has all these different learning facilities like science and history. And yes, you mentioned the Walters, but that's also farther from the Inner Harbor. And with the Inner Harbor, you have all of these different resources that allow you to go around it, like the water taxi. You have the Charm City circulator that passes through that site. You have plenty of parking around there. And I think for me, the big inspiration was bringing art into the Inner Harbor.
So that's a great point that you mentioned. You wanted to bring art, but if you're going to bring art, then you have to treat the art correctly, and the architecture that you create around the art has to serve the art correctly. For example, having an all-glass gallery, like it's great for sculpture, some sculptures, but for art that's going to be on a wall, it's going to destroy them. And then, if you took the step and said, okay, it's going to be art, I'm going to create walls and maybe create light aperture, ceiling apertures that allow diffuse light into the gallery, you're blocking views from these guys, and I guarantee you, they're going to fight you tooth and nail. All these houses and stuff that are in the harbor, because their view shed corridors are one of the main reasons they bought property on the water. Because whenever you try to do anything on that highway, you know, especially at the time, you know, anything that you want to build taller, they will fight you tooth and nail because they really appreciate what they've invested in, which is the viewshed corridors. So you, again, when you propose these ideas, you sort of have to run them through and sort of put them through rigorous questioning. Is this the right program? Is this the right architecture to treat that program? Is this the right form? You know, could it be broken into other ways as opposed to, and there's some school of thoughts that would say, okay, I just want a bombastic, larger-than-life architecture that says, I am here, that's going to be my thesis, fine. But then you have to be able to justify it at every single corner. Because it's a good point about it being an art museum. I mean, there's a visionary museum next door that's fantastic. Like you mentioned it earlier, it's actually one of the joys of the Inner Harbor, going to the visionary, and it's literally next door to this. So I would just sort of ask you the other thing also, if it's a gallery and I'm in Federal Hill, and I'm trying to get to the water, I really can't use this because after 5 p.m., the gallery is going to close and I can't go through and get down to the water. So you just have to think of all these things in layers and sort of help you arrive at a cleaner solution. But I think as a bombastic gesture, as a, hey, I'm here gesture, I think it's bold.
What's the term you use, the structural janitor? The term, structural janitor, is that what you use?
Cleaning up.
I would do the same thing for railings on this project. I mean, once,
All the edges.
yeah, all the edges of this thing, you, especially in this country, you have to think about those very differently, given the fact that you can't make these big, long stairs with nothing. Well, in these drawings, except for the very top, they're invisible. So that level of detail would just be critical to making this thing okay.
All right, Jamie Tillman is in China, and so I'm going to read his statement to you, Leslie. Congratulations, Leslie, on completing your thesis project. While I'm very sorry not to be in attendance today, I know from personal experience as your thesis chair, all of the focus, time, and dedication you've expended to get to this significant moment. As to your project itself, I'm certain that you have just concluded a lively dialogue concerning its impact on Baltimore and its exploration of the connection between history and contemporary life, which is thematic in our East Coast cities. In other words, going from the past to the present, how do we bridge the gap between history and the zeitgeist of today? I'd like to say in the end that of all the many projects at a variety of levels that have specifically addressed this site and its intricate web of connections to the elements that create the dynamic life of the city, your thesis stands out for me as perhaps the most transformative proposal that we have seen for the Inner Harbor. As a bold conception for a new gateway to the city, a dynamic arts venue that would undoubtedly become a landmark for the city. And as a symbolic extension of the past into the future, you are to be commended on the strength of its inception. Congratulations, and thank you for bringing this
Thank you.
topic to us. All right. Faculty and jurors up in the Dean's